The college football playoff format is up for debate, and the SEC, the Big Ten, they want more control, while the ACC is resisting change. How is this going to impact Clemson? We'll talk about all that right now on Locked On Clemson.
You are Locked On Clemson, your daily podcast on the Clemson Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Tiger fans? Morgan Thomas here, Clemson fan, Clemson grad, host and producer of Locked On Clemson, and host and producer over at 105.5 and 97.5 The Roar. Wherever you listen to Clemson athletics, you can find it over there on the radio. And thanks for making Locked On Clemson your first listen every day. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And if you're new to the show, hit that like and subscribe button. And over on YouTube, you can hit that notification bell so you'll never miss an episode. I'm telling you, with Locked On, it's been so great because I've been able to talk about Clemson Monday through Friday, so you never want to miss out on my exclusive Clemson content I put out every single week. And don't forget to follow me over on X at The Morgan T Show. Hey, today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's FanDuel. All right, today on today's show, the history of college football and what we've seen. I want to look in the past and see if these top four spots really are good for Clemson, bad for Clemson, good for equality, bad for equality and fairness. We will talk about it in round one. Also going to talk about the first round buys and how they shook out this year. And do I think that's going to continue and matter in the next couple of years? And then also there is talk about that 14-team or more playoff. How does this impact Clemson? I've got some thoughts on that as well. But let's start with a simple question. Who has been really benefiting from the top four or being in the top four over the past couple of years in the college football playoffs? Now, the SEC and the Big Ten, they want to switch up the system. If you noticed in the previous system we had, or at least the first system that we've had so far, I know we're already trying to change it, which is crazy to say. But in the first system, after the first year, it was really seeding based on conference champions and rank of conference champions. And that kind of allowed for an even distribution between the different conferences that are out there. And I thought in a lot of ways that was the fairest way possible to spread the love out around college football. If you want college football to become something that is more of a national brand, to become something that is seen from coast to coast, and other universities that are not just in the SEC and the Big Ten, then you want that type of college football playoff format. And I believe that it worked for that. Now, there were some frustrations with that and the way they did the first round or the way they did the top four and how it shook out at the end. But it sounds like to me that right now, I think you all can agree, unless we were an SEC podcast, which we are not, or a Big Ten podcast, it sounds like that fairness on the surface is not really what they want. They want to get into having it dominated by the SEC and the Big Ten because they think they're better than everyone. And really, the viewership numbers are there for sure. And the ESPN and the other like Fox and those places are really showing them and throwing the money at them. So how could you really blame them for saying, hey, we want a bigger piece of the pie because of what we bring to the table? So I'm not hating the player. I hate the game, right? That's what they always say. That's kind of where I feel about it right now. I'm not super upset about the SEC and the Big Ten doing what's in their best interest, but I don't know how it's going to impact the rest of college football and specifically Clemson, because that's the team that you and we care about the most, unless you're just kind of like an outsider listening in to this show. So if you look back at the past couple of years, let's scoot back to 2020 in the college football playoff rankings, and let's see kind of how it shook out. Well, we know in 2020, our Tigers were in there. That was Alabama was number 1, Clemson number 2, Ohio State number 3, and Notre Dame number 4. Now, Ohio State only played 6 games. This was that COVID year. And Notre Dame went 10-1. Clemson went 10-1. Alabama went 11-0. Alabama ended up beating Ohio State. Notre Dame and Ohio Clemson lost to Ohio State 49-28. That was one where Ryan Day and Ohio State finally got their win over the Tigers, but I try to forget that one. But if you look at it overall, really my point being, you had an SEC team, you had an ACC team, a Big Ten team, and an independent. Right under that, you had Texas A&M. So you really had a good mix in 2020, I believe, for what you could say fairness. Now, when you move forward to 2021, you look at Georgia was number one, 12-0, Michigan 11-1, Alabama 11-1, and Cincinnati 12-0. So you had an American Conference team, a group of five there. You had SEC, Big Ten, and SEC. So two SEC teams in the Big Ten in 2021. 2022, you had Georgia, Michigan, TCU, and USC. So you had a Pac-12 team there, a Big 12 team, Big 10 team, and an SEC team. So another pretty well-rounded top 10, or top 4 rather. And then in 2023, you had Georgia, Michigan, Washington, and Florida State in the week 14. Let's see what week 15 was: Michigan, Washington, Texas, Alabama at the end. So Michigan was number 1, Washington number 2, Texas and Alabama number 3 and 4. Basically, at that point, you have 2 Big Ten teams and 2 SEC teams, which kind of shake it all out to really the way that they seem to be wanting it. And then in 2024, you had at week 16, Oregon, Georgia, Texas, and Penn State. And those teams were not your highest seeded teams. So that's kind of where the problem or the concern goes in, is because those were your highest ranking teams, but they did not get seeded. Seeding, Oregon got number 1, so they were 1-1. Georgia got 2-2. Texas was 3, but got 5. Penn State was 4, but got 6. And Notre Dame was 5, but got 7. Ultimately, you had a Notre Dame and Ohio State matchup, which was Ohio State was 6, and they got seeding 8th. So, the seedings were much lower than their actual final rankings. And I think that's kind of where this all shook out. I do feel like that it makes a little bit more sense to me. So when you recap the past 5 seasons or so, does it seem like the SEC and the Big Ten are represented more than other conferences? Yes, they are, give or take, represented more than other conferences. And that makes sense to me, because I do think at the top part of their conference, they do have some of the best teams in the country. So it really doesn't hurt my feelings that you would say that some of the top 4 teams that are going to get those buys would be SEC and Big Ten teams. I really don't like where you have a Boise State or an Arizona State getting a bye when they really weren't one of the best 4 teams in the country. To me, I would lean more towards going to the new system. Now, I know a lot of people would say, well, hey, Morgan, that's going to probably give an advantage to the SEC and the Big Ten to have those buys. And in the next segment, I'll talk about, does buys really matter or not? But for Clemson, I don't think right now, with the way that the college football playoffs is, that's a huge concern for me, because I do think that Clemson can get into the top 4. They have been able to do that multiple times in the past, more than multiple times. I mean, more than one handful of times. I think 6 times overall they've been in the top 4. So it's not that Clemson can't get into the top 4 and be seen as, on a national level, one of the best teams in the country. Will it get harder as we go, as we keep increasing the teams? I think so. And we'll talk about that in segment 3. But a direct path to the first round bye doesn't really hurt me too much if they say, hey, we're just going to do the first 4 seeds are going to be those for sure first round buys. Now, my bigger problem with it is that they go to a neutral site, and I really love to see college football game played at the home site of the higher ranking team. What I saw this past season was amazing. I want to see a ton of it, more of it. Home games, home playoff games with a college football atmosphere was amazing. Clemson still is always going to need to go to get in the top 10, or the top 4 rather. Clemson's always going to need to go 12-1, I wouldn't even say 12-2, 12-1, or excuse me. Yeah. 12-1 or 12-0. 13-0, excuse me, including the championship game. That's what I'm missing there. So they need to go 12-1 or 13-0 to be able to really get into that top 4. They have to prove that they can sweep the slate on the ACC and have no problem against their out-of-conference opponents with South Carolina and maybe another SEC team. But for now, Clemson has to be nearly perfect to get into the ACC or get into the ACC championship game and then into the top 4 of the college football playoffs, which, again, I would be more concerned if they'd never done it before. So that's where I'm not as nervous about it. Now, I kind of worry a lot, but in this case, I really don't worry about it. And we'll also talk about, does that first round bye really help or not? And maybe that kind of eases my pain into this whole situation. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. I love using FanDuel because of how easy it is to use. And when you win, you get your money paid to you instantly. What's better than that? Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just FanDuel.com. Join there today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, we always talk about how valuable the first round bye is in the college football playoffs and how that was going to be going into this season. And really, after this season, you kind of walked away from it saying, was it as valuable as I thought? More or less, there's less risk of injury when you don't play as many games. You have more time to prepare, get your coaching staff and your practices underway, and an extra week or so to be able to analyze your opponent that you could possibly have, watch those games and enjoy it with your teammates, and then prepare for that game, whoever wins. But there's something interesting that we saw this year that I think may or may not be a continuation in the future, and that is that all of the first round byes struggled. Georgia lost to Notre Dame, a number 2 team. Oregon lost to Ohio State, number 1 team. Boise State, number 4 team, lost to Penn State, and Arizona State lost to Texas. So all of the higher seeded teams that had those first round byes did not do well once they got their opportunity. Now, I don't know. There's a lot of different reasons why that is. And I think it kind of goes back to why I'm not as upset about using that first 4 or the top 4 ranking for the first 4 byes, is because I don't really think that Boise State was the 4th best team or 3rd best team in the country. I don't think Arizona State was one of the 4 best teams in the country. Looking back, Georgia struggled to be struggled later on in the season. And I don't know if Georgia really was one of those teams that was one of the top 4, but they were ranked in the top 4. So I'd give them that. Oregon there as well, ranked number 1. I thought they were number 1. I actually picked Oregon to win, but then the seeding kind of worked out to where Oregon and Ohio State played each other again in a Big Ten rematch. And a lot of controversy around that, because I agree with some fans that say that Oregon-Ohio State game was probably more of a national championship caliber team or matchup rather than the Ohio State-Notre Dame game. Looking back, if you would have said Oregon-Ohio State in the national championship, I think it would have been a more competitive game than Ohio State and Notre Dame, even though Notre Dame tried to make a game of it at the end. So what does this mean? Is the first round bye really bad for Clemson? Should Clemson even care at all? Honestly, I think you probably already know my answer from what I've been talking about, but I don't think that Clemson should really care. I don't think Clemson fans should really be worried about the first round bye at all. I don't think Clemson should be really worried about the top 4 and how they end up shaking that out at all, because going back to it, Clemson has been in the top 4 multiple times. We know that. We know that they can get there. We know that they can plow through the ACC. We know that Dabo Swinney can recruit, and now he's in the transfer portal market, so he's even more lethal. So to me, I'm not super worried about being a top 4 team. Also, with this history of at least the short sample size, small sample size that we have, having that rest may or may not help you. Now, we'll have to see what happens in the next couple of years if this still continues this trend. But I thought it was very interesting because a lot of people cited like Major League Baseball and like the Philadelphia Phillies or like teams like like the Dodgers in the past or the Yankees, where they really were a lower seed, but they were able to come out and come out on top. And so a lot of fans that are Braves fans would probably understand this, and the fact that the Braves had those buys and seemed to play worse against teams that didn't have those buys. So there could be some things to be said about having more experience, or maybe not so much experience, but at least like more practice, less time to be sitting on the couch, if you will. So more time to keep your body in motion and keep yourself in that football mentality and your body in that elite football level of play. So when you have a week off or 2 weeks off, maybe that could hurt you in the long run. And I think maybe that is true. So that's another reason why I'm not super concerned about Clemson not being in the top 4. So these upsets that we saw the past couple of this last season, I think really probably could happen more often than not. And those teams, I don't think they really lost because of rust either, right? So I do mention that is a concern, but I think that it was really going back to seeding. Those teams shouldn't have been the lower seeds in the first place. They lost because they were stronger opponents. They played the higher ranked teams played stronger opponents and better teams than they really should have. And that's the real issue. And that's why they have the straight seeding proposal that's out there. And that's why I'm actually okay with it. So if Clemson wins the ACC and gets a first round bye, and they do it in the top 4 ranking side of things, I think that's a great thing, because we know for sure Clemson is definitely one of the best 4 teams in the country. If Clemson gets a first round bye and they get it just because they're an ACC, one of the, say 4th highest ranked conference champion, then I really don't like that, because you could be a 4th highest ranked conference champion and still kind of suck. So we've seen that with those other teams, or I don't want to disrespect them in saying suck. I would just say that they're just not at the caliber of the other teams in the SEC, the Big Ten, and even maybe the ACC and the Big 12. So they have to fight their way through all the way into the conference championship game. I get that you want to reward them for getting into the conference championship game, but I don't think you need to reward them with the ability to have a first round bye in the college football playoffs if they truly aren't one of the best 4 teams in the country. And maybe I'm missing this or something. I don't know. Let me know over on X at the Morgan T Show. I'd love to continue the conversation. And don't forget to subscribe so you can keep up with all the Clemson coverage and college football playoff coverage that we talk about as well. All right, next up, we're going to talk about the 14-team playoff part of this. And could this put Clemson at a major disadvantage or not? All right, so let's talk about the 2026 playoff and beyond, because it's really not 2025. We've talked about this in the past and kind of right when it first came out, but we have a 12-team playoff right now. There is push for a 14-team format, maybe a 16-team playoff format, or even larger, which I would say gets to get into kind of a little bit of a disaster area. And the way that they're setting it up could be bad news for Clemson in the long run. And here is why. The SEC and the Big Ten, they want to have 4 automatic spots each. Okay, so that would be 8 total teams from the SEC and the Big Ten getting into the college football playoffs. And then the ACC and the Big 12 would only get 2 each. So that would be 4 total. So that would be your 10. And then, that would be your 12. And then your final 2 would be the group of 6 gets 1, maybe 5 if the Pac-12 comes back. And then Notre Dame would more than likely get that last final at-large, or what you would maybe say like a wild card spot. I think they're calling it an at-large spot. But for me, personally, I'm calling it the Notre Dame spot. But that would mean that Clemson, if they stay in the ACC, they're guaranteed, the ACC as a conference is just guaranteed 2 spots. Now, would that go to the 2 teams that go to your championship game? I would hope so. I would hope that you wouldn't put, your 3rd best ACC team in above your one that went to the championship game and had to play an extra game. So it almost seemed like those teams need to have that stress of being able to get into the playoffs off of their shoulders. But I understand if there's the lower seeded team in the ACC championship game has multiple losses, and this could put them significantly behind the third place team, then I could see where it could be the first and the third place ACC team like we kind of thought we might have this season. So imagine this scenario. Clemson goes 10-2, all right? And they are ranked second in the ACC. They make the playoff, but they're not going to be one of the top seeds. They're not going to be a top 4 seed for sure. They're not going to get a first round bye. They're going to immediately be a lowest ranked seed, kind of like what they were this season. And they're going to have to play a higher seed team. And it's not going to be much change for them, but still going to be the same level of difficulty, right? But on the other hand, a conference like the SEC, they're going to have to find ways to seed those 4 teams. Now, one of the proposals is to have a championship game to still have that, matter, but also have like a championship weekend where you have your 1 and 2 seed play for the SEC regular season title, then your 3 and 4 seed team, or it's like your 3 and 8 seed, and then your 4 and 7 seed play for the other spots that are out there. So you've got an issue here where you have the 8th best SEC team could potentially be at the end of the season playing for a playoff bid. And if you look back at the 8th best SEC team, I mean, you're not going to like what you see in many ways. So when you look at the standings for the SEC, you could be looking at a team that definitely has 3 or 4 losses, having an opportunity to get into the college football playoffs, maybe even a 5-loss team. So you look at, say, 2024, right? The Longhorns were number 1, Bulldogs 2, Volunteers 3, Alabama 4, LSU 5, South Carolina 6, Texas A&M 7, Ole Miss will be 8. Now, Ole Miss had 3 losses. Texas A&M had 5 losses. And South Carolina had 4 losses by the end of the season. So you're looking at teams that are going to have 3, 4, potentially even at risk of having 5 losses and being one of those top half of the conference teams that could play for a conference championship game, not a conference championship game, but could play for a college football playoff spot. And that's where my concern about the system being a little bit unfair for Clemson and the ACC and other conferences, because at that point you are giving your conference more high profile games like a championship weekend. So that there are going to be more big eyes on those kind of games. There's going to be kind of like a playoff atmosphere for those kind of games. They're going to get the best TV time slots as well. Meanwhile, while your conference is kind of just doing the same. So if you think about the ACC and Clemson, not much changes for them other than the fact that their opponents, their rivals, and especially the teams that they're having to play in and play against, or I would say that are their rivals in recruiting. And so you're having teams that are being able to say, hey, you know what? We're the 5th, 6th seed in the SEC. We're still going to be able to fight for a possible one of those 4 automatic seeds for our conference if we win enough games at the end of the season or win that championship week game at the end of the season. I would not like that if I'm Clemson, if I'm still having to fight for best of my conference or second best of my conference. Meanwhile, my in-state rival, South Carolina or Georgia or Texas A&M or Tennessee, other teams that maybe I'm fighting for in recruiting like Florida, they're basically saying, hey, you know what? We could win a couple of games. We could stub our toe here and there. And as long as we get into that championship week and we're in the top half of our conference, then we could go on and possibly, pull an upset and get into the college football playoffs. So imagine a team that's not only making more money than you are, but now they're playing more high profile, hyped up games in front of national audiences. They're playing one more than you are. And then they're also not as good of a team as you are, but getting an opportunity to get into the playoffs more or earlier with a worse record than you are. So that raises the big question for me. Should Clemson just get out of the ACC? And my problem with that, continuing that discussion, is if they do, then can they do that right now? I don't think they can do it right now. It feels to me, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but it feels a little too late in a lot of ways. Clemson is one of the biggest brands in the ACC, but the conference seems to be losing ground to the SEC and the Big Ten. Now, the good thing is it's not just the ACC. So I think that if the ACC could kind of team up with the Big 12, the American, and the Pac-12, or whatever the pack is right now, Pac-9. I think if they could team up with each other, I think it would be much better for them, because it feels like that there's a lot of strength in the SEC and the Big Ten, and a lot of weakness in the ACC and the other conference just doing what they want to do. And I think that 2026 is really going to shape up the future of college football. If it goes too heavy against the conferences that are not the SEC and the Big Ten, then I think that you could probably see some heavy pushback as well. And maybe Clemson and the ACC find a way to have an advantage, or at least have an argument on their side, and can go to court or whatever you may do nowadays. I know it seems like everything goes to court nowadays. So right now, Clemson is still, again, one of the biggest brands in the country, in the ACC. And they just need to keep doing what they're doing, focus on what they're doing. I know that there's still the lawsuit out there, but I really haven't heard much about it and how that impacts the Clemson Tigers, and if that's really going to continue. Because I know that the ACC has already added in some more money for the better brands, the teams like the Clemson teams and the Florida States and the North Carolinas and the Dukes out there that are winning more games, that are getting to the more national televised postseason games. So I do feel like that the ACC is doing what they can to make sure their biggest and best teams and brands are benefiting the most. But in the long run, with less money than your rival in other conferences, and then with less games than your rival and less high profile games than your rival, and then also when your rival has more opportunities to get into the college football playoffs than you, that to me is just really just snowballs into a not a good situation for Clemson. My concern for Clemson, as I've always mentioned, is I love that Clemson is a huge brand. I love Clemson because I'm a graduate there, but does the SEC really want them? I don't know. I mean, they got Georgia just an hour away to the west. They've got South Carolina just an hour and a half or so away to the east. Do they really need another team in this market? I don't know. Maybe it still matters, because those games would still be huge games, and the fandom and the fan base of Clemson, they pay big money and they travel. So maybe that's still very good for them. But then on the flip side, maybe the Big Ten wants Clemson more because they don't have a presence in the South, and Clemson and Florida State or other teams could be an entry into an area of the country that they haven't tapped into. Or maybe the ACC and the Big 12 or someone does something to where they can build up and produce a conference that is a somewhat of a rival to, the stronghold that the SEC and the Big Ten have. I'm not sure. There's a lot of unknowns for sure. But what I do know is that I'm not so worried about Clemson getting into the top four. I'm not so worried about Clemson getting into the playoffs, but I do not want in the long run for your rivals, not just being South Carolina, just any rival in general that you're going to be recruiting against. I don't want them to have a blatant advantage in the postseason or in getting higher profile games on a regular basis, and the money part as well. We already know that's a problem. So let me know what you think. I appreciate you being a part of the show. You can get in on the comments over on YouTube, or you can follow me over on X at the Morgan T Show. I appreciate everyone being a part of the show. That's it for today. Thank you for making Locked On Clemson your first listen today. For your second listen, check out Locked On ACC podcast. Alex Dono, Kenton Gibbs, keep it real and bring you the truth about where your favorite ACC team stands within the conference. Find Locked On ACC on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. That's it for today's show. Thank you so much for making Locked On Clemson your first listen today. For your second listen, check out Locked On College Basketball for Isaac Schott and Andy Patton. They don't wait Thank you so much for making Locked On Clemson your first listen today. For your second listen, check out Locked On College Basketball with Isaac Schad and Andy Patton. Don't wait for March to be the most informed college basketball fan right now. Find Locked On College Basketball on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And as always, Tiger fans, we'll see you at the top of the hill.